On August 15, 1965, the Beatles stopped playing mid-song at Shea Stadium, and 55,600 screaming fans fell completely silent in 3 seconds flat. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? The deafening roar that had drowned out even the amplifiers suddenly vanished. John Lennon's hands froze on his guitar strings. Paul McCartney's bass note hung in the air, unfinished. George Harrison took a step back from his microphone, his eyes scanning the massive crowd. Behind the drums, Ringo Starr slowly lowered his sticks, staring at something no one else could see yet. For the first time in Beatles concert history, you could hear the wind whistling through the stadium. The security guards, who moments before had been fighting back waves of hysterical teenagers, stood frozen in confusion. Something had happened in the third row that would change everything about that night. But to understand why John Lennon did what he did next, you need to know about the girl with the handwritten sign. Her name was Margaret Collins. 16 years old. From Queens, New York. She'd camped outside Shea Stadium for 14 hours, just to get a seat in the third row, while other fans brought banners declaring their love for Paul or John. Margaret's sign was different. 3 words, written in thick black marker on white cardboard. 3 words that shouldn't have been visible from the stage through the chaos of Beatlemania. But somehow, in that exact moment when the Beatles were launching into Can't Buy Me Love, John saw it. And when he did, his blood ran cold. The sign read, I know Stuart. Stuart Sutcliffe, the 5th Beatle, who died in Hamburg 3 years earlier. The one they never talked about in interviews. The one whose death still haunted John in ways he couldn't explain to anyone, not even Paul. How could this American teenager know about Stuart? The Beatles had worked hard to keep that chapter of their history buried, locked away with the memories of dirty Hamburg clubs and amphetamine-fueled performances. But Margaret Collins knew, and John needed to know how. But here's where the story takes a turn. Nobody could have predicted. Paul noticed John's frozen stance first. They'd performed together for nearly 8 years, through Hamburg's seedy underground and Liverpool's Cavern Club, through screaming crowds and hostile audiences. Paul knew every one of John's stage movements, every gesture, every look. This wasn't stage fright. This wasn't equipment failure. This was something deeper. Paul followed John's gaze into the crowd, searching for whatever had turned his partner to stone. That's when he saw her, the girl with the sign, now holding it against her chest, tears streaming down her face. George's guitar solo in Can't Buy Me Love was supposed to last exactly 16 bars. He'd played it the same way 247 times on tour. But when he reached bar 8 and realized John wasn't coming back in, he improvised, stretching the solo, buying time. The crowd, conditioned to scream through every song regardless of what they could actually hear, began to sense something was wrong. The screaming softened to a confused murmur. Ringo kept the beat steady, his eyes darting between his bandmates, waiting for a signal, any signal, about what to do next. The Shea Stadium concert of August 15, 1965, was already destined for the history books. It was the Beatles' biggest show yet, breaking attendance records, generating $304,000 in revenue, unheard of for a single concert in 1965. Ed Sullivan had introduced them. The mayor of New York had given them the key to the city. 2,000 police officers formed human barriers around the stadium. But none of that mattered now, because John Lennon was walking toward the edge of the stage. The security guards tensed. The last time a Beatle had gotten this close to the crowd at a concert, 37 fans had been hospitalized in the resulting surge. The head of security, a former Marine named Frank Morrison, started moving toward the stage, ready to tackle John if necessary. But something in John's movements stopped him. This wasn't the cocky, swaggering Lennon who'd mock the audience between songs. This was different, vulnerable, almost frightened. "Stop," What you're about to hear changes everything about what really happened that night. John knelt at the edge of the stage, the microphone in his hand, picked up his heavy breathing, amplifying it across the stadium. 55,000 people held their breath. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks. But John didn't notice. His eyes were locked on Margaret Collins, the girl with the sign. She was maybe 15 feet away, separated by a metal barrier and a line of increasingly nervous security guards. John raised the microphone to his lips. "How do you know about Stewart?" His voice cracked on the name. The question echoed across the stadium, picked up by the massive Altec Lansing sound system. The Beatles had specifically requested for this show. In the upper decks, fans looked at each other in confusion. Who was Stewart? What was happening? Why had the music stopped? Margaret Collins stood up slowly, her sign clutched to her chest. The fans around her backed away, creating a small circle of space in the packed crowd. She was trembling, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear enough for John's directional microphone to pick up. "He was my cousin. Stuart Sutcliffe was my cousin." The stadium erupted in confused whispers. Paul's bass guitar slipped from his hands, saved from hitting the stage floor only by its strap. George had stopped playing entirely now, his Gretsch country gentleman hanging silent. Ringo stood up from his drum kit, something he'd never done mid-concert before. The Beatles looked at each other, four young men suddenly confronted with a ghost they thought they'd left buried in Hamburg. But Margaret wasn't finished. She held up something else, a photograph. Even from the stage, John could see what it was. Hamburg, 1961. The original 5 Beatles standing outside the Kaiserkeller Club. John, Paul, George, Pete Best on drums before Ringo replaced him. And Stewart, beautiful, talented Stewart, who'd chosen art over music, love over the band, and died of a brain hemorrhage at 21 years old. The photograph shouldn't exist. They'd thought they'd destroyed them all. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. "Stewart wrote me letters," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger, carrying across the hushed stadium. "Every week from Hamburg, he told me about the band. About you, John. About how you were going to change the world. He said," she paused, tears streaming down her face. "He said, if anything happened to him, I should find you, give you something. He made me promise." John stood up abruptly, the microphone creating a piercing feedback squeal that made thousands wince. Paul stepped forward, reaching for John's arm, but John shook him off. This was impossible. Stewart had been dead for 3 years. He died in his fiancée Astrid's arms in Hamburg, April 10, 1962. The Beatles had been playing at the Star Club when they got the news. John had locked himself in a bathroom stall and sobbed for 2 hours. They'd never talked about it since. Never mentioned Stewart in interviews. Never acknowledged there had been a 5th Beatle who'd helped shape their sound, their look, their entire identity. "What did he want you to give me?" John's question was barely a whisper, but the stadium's sound system carried it to every corner. The wind had picked up, rustling through the stands, carrying the smell of hot dogs and summer sweat, and 60,000 bodies pressed together. Photographers were climbing over each other, trying to capture this unprecedented moment. Ed Sullivan stood in the wings, frantically gesturing to his production team, unsure whether to cut the broadcast or let it roll. Margaret reached into her purse, a simple white leather bag that her mother had given her for her 16th birthday just 2 weeks earlier. The security guards moved closer, hands reaching for weapons, but Frank Morrison held them back with a raised fist. He'd seen enough to know this wasn't a threat. This was something else entirely, something private being played out in the most public venue imaginable. She pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, creased from being carried, but intact. The crowd nearest to her could see something written on the front in Stewart's distinctive handwriting, the same artistic scrawl that had covered his canvases. The paintings that now hung in galleries in Hamburg and Liverpool, worth thousands of pounds. Margaret held it up toward the stage. "He said to give this to you if the Beatles ever became famous. He said you'd understand when to open it. Here's the detail that changes everything you thought you knew about the Beatles. John Lennon, the tough, sarcastic leader of the Beatles, the man who'd mocked reporters and insulted royalty, began walking off the stage toward the crowd." Paul grabbed his arm. "John, what are you doing? There's 50,000 people watching." But John yanked free. George stepped forward, blocking his path. "Think about this, mate. Whatever's in that letter, it doesn't have to be now. Not here." But Ringo, quiet Ringo, who usually stayed out of the drama, walked up behind them. "Let him go," he said simply. "Stuart was his best friend, before any of us. Let him go." The security barrier was 3 feet high, topped with barbed wire to prevent fans from climbing over. Frank Morrison watched John Lennon, the most famous musician in the world, preparing to climb down into a crowd that could tear him apart in seconds. Every instinct screamed at Morrison to stop him. This violated every security protocol. His entire career, his reputation, hung on keeping the Beatles safe. But something in John's eyes stopped him. This wasn't celebrity drama. This was human pain, raw and real. Morrison turned to his team. "Form a corridor. 2 lines. From here to the girl. Nobody else gets through." The guards moved with military precision, creating a human pathway through the crowd. Fans pressed against them, screaming, crying, reaching, but the guards held firm. John climbed over the barrier, his boots hitting the dirt track that surrounded the baseball field. For the first time since 1962, John Lennon was standing in a crowd without the stage to protect him. The walk to Margaret Collins took 30 seconds. It felt like 30 years. John could hear individual voices now, girls crying his name, begging him to look at them, touch them, acknowledge them. But his eyes stayed fixed on Margaret, this teenager from Queens who'd suddenly become the most important person in Shea Stadium. When he reached her, the crowd fell silent again. Even the wind seemed to pause. Margaret handed him the envelope. Her hand was shaking. John's was steady as he took it. But Paul, watching from the stage, could see his shoulders trembling. The envelope was light, containing maybe a single sheet of paper. John turned it over. On the back, in Stuart's handwriting, were 3 words: "When you're ready." "You haven't heard the darkest part yet." John opened the envelope. The paper inside was fragile, threatening to tear at the creases where it had been folded. He unfolded it carefully, aware that thousands of camera lenses were trained on him, that this moment would be photographed, filmed, documented forever. But he didn't care. Stuart's handwriting filled the page, slanted and artistic, the words of a dead friend reaching across 3 years of silence. The letter began, "John, if you're reading this, it means we did it. The Beatles became what we always dreamed about in those Hamburg nights. But I need to tell you something I couldn't say when I was alive." John's legs nearly buckled. Frank Morrison stepped forward, ready to catch him, but John waved him off. He kept reading, his face changing with each line, cycling through confusion, shock, and finally, understanding. The crowd watched in rapt attention as tears began rolling down John Lennon's face, not the performative tears of a showman, but real devastating grief. George, still on stage, turned to Paul. "We need to do something. This is getting out of control." Paul nodded, slinging his bass back on. He walked to John's microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a brief intermission. Please stay in your seats." But nobody was listening to Paul. Every eye in Shea Stadium was fixed on John Lennon, standing in the crowd, holding a letter from a dead friend. This moment would haunt everyone who witnessed it. John looked up from the letter, directly at Margaret Collins. "Is this real? Is this really from Stuart?" His voice broke completely on his friend's name. Margaret nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. He gave it to me 2 days before he died. Somehow he knew he didn't have much time. He said the Beatles were going to be bigger than Elvis. Everyone laughed at him, but he knew." John folded the letter carefully, placing it inside his jacket pocket, against his heart. Then he did something that shocked everyone, including his bandmates. He hugged Margaret Collins. Not a celebrity photo op hug, but a real embrace, the kind shared between people who've lost someone they loved. The crowd exploded in a mixture of screams and sobs. Photographers' flashes turned the moment into a strobe-lit dream sequence. When John finally pulled away, he spoke into the microphone he'd carried down with him. His voice echoed across the stadium, raw and broken. "Stuart Sutcliffe was the fifth Beatle. He was my best friend. He taught us how to look cool, how to dress, how to carry ourselves like artists instead of just musicians." He died in Hamburg on April 10, 1962, and we never talked about it because it hurt too much. But he never stopped believing in us, even when we didn't believe in ourselves. Paul, George and Ringo stood frozen on stage. They'd agreed years ago to keep Stuart's story private, to let him rest in peace. But here was John, spilling their most carefully guarded secret to 55,600 strangers. And somehow, it felt right. It felt like something Stuart would have wanted. One last moment in the spotlight he'd walked away from to pursue his art. But what happened next stunned even John's bandmates. John turned back to Margaret. "The letter says Stuart left something else, something hidden. Do you know what he meant?" Margaret's eyes widened. She nodded slowly, reaching into her purse again. This time, she pulled out a small key, attached to a leather cord that had clearly been worn around someone's neck for years. "He said you'd know what it opens. He said it's in Hamburg, at the Kaiserkeller, behind the wall where you used to write set lists." Margaret pressed the key into John's palm. "He said the Beatles would need it when the fame became too much. When you started forgetting why you played music in the first place." The Kaiserkeller, the club where the Beatles had played 8-hour sets, surviving on amphetamines and willpower, transforming from amateur Liverpool boys into a tight, explosive band. The wall where they'd written set lists was also where Stuart had sketched between sets, where they'd carved their names one drunk night, where they'd made a pact to stick together no matter what. John clutched the key so tightly his knuckles turned white. Suddenly, the opening notes of Twist and Shout rang out across the stadium. John looked up to see Paul at the microphone, George's guitar wailing, Ringo pounding the drums with renewed intensity. They were covering for him, giving him time to process, to return. The crowd, desperate for normalcy after the emotional scene they'd witnessed, began screaming again. But it was different now, softer, more human. John looked at Margaret one more time. "Thank you." Stuart would have. He couldn't finish. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the stage, the security corridor closing behind him, as guards helped him over the barrier. The crowd reached for him, but gently now, patting his shoulders, touching his jacket like he was a religious figure who'd shared a moment of divine revelation. The truth about what was hidden in Hamburg would change everything. As John climbed back on stage, Paul shot him a look that said they'd talk about this later. George nodded, a silent acknowledgement that some secrets were too heavy to carry forever. Ringo, still drumming, gave John the slightest smile, permission to be human, to grieve, to break the carefully constructed Beatle facade when necessary. John picked up his guitar, the Rickenbacker 325 that had become his signature instrument. His fingers found the familiar chords of Twist and Shout, but his mind was elsewhere, in Hamburg, in a dirty club, with a brilliant artist who'd chosen love over fame and paid the ultimate price. The letter in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The Beatles finished their set. 12 songs in 35 minutes, standard for 1965, when the screaming made longer performances pointless. They played I Feel Fine, Dizzy Miss Lizzie, Ticket to Ride, Act Naturally, Can't Buy Me Love Again from the Beginning, Babies in Black, and Help. But everyone who was there knew the concert had really ended when John read that letter. Everything after was just noise. As they ran off stage to the waiting armored car that would ferry them away from the hysteria, Ed Sullivan grabbed John's arm. What was in the letter? The world's going to want to know. John looked at him with eyes that had aged years in minutes. Some things aren't for the world, Ed. Some things are just for us. 3 months later, the Beatles would make a secret trip to Hamburg. The story of what they found behind that wall in the Kaiser Keller has never been fully told. There are rumors, of course. Some say it was Stuart's final paintings, works that predicted the Beatles' future with eerie accuracy. Others claim it was recordings from their earliest Hamburg shows, when Stuart was still playing bass, evidence of the fifth Beatles' contribution to their sound. A few insist it was something more personal, letters between John and Stuart that revealed the true depth of their friendship, the kind of bond that transcends death. What we do know is that the Beatles were never quite the same after Shea Stadium. They stopped touring entirely within a year, retreating to the studio to create Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's, albums that pushed the boundaries of what rock music could be. Some say it was exhaustion from the constant screaming. Others blame the pressure of fame. But those who were at Shea Stadium on August 15, 1965, knew the truth. It was Stuart. It was always Stuart. Margaret Collins disappeared into history after that night. She never sold her story to the newspapers, never capitalized on her moment of fame. Years later, a journalist tracked her down to a small town in Oregon, where she worked as an art teacher. She had only one thing to say. Stuart knew they'd change the world. He just wanted to make sure they remembered why they started. That letter, that key, it was his way of keeping them grounded, human. I did what he asked. That's all. John Lennon never publicly discussed the contents of Stuart's letter. In a 1970 interview with Rolling Stone, he was asked directly about that night at Shea Stadium. His response was characteristically cryptic. Stuart saw things we couldn't see. He was outside the bubble. You know, he could look at the Beatles objectively in a way we never could. That letter, it predicted everything. The breakup, the solo careers, all of it. But it also reminded us that we were friends first, before we were Beatles. Sometimes I wish we'd remembered that better. But here's what nobody knew until now. In 1980, just weeks before his death, John Lennon gave an interview to a small British music magazine that was never published. The magazine folded before the issue could go to print, and the interview tapes were thought lost. But in 2010, they surfaced in an estate sale in Liverpool. On those tapes, John finally revealed what Stuart's letter had said. Stuart knew he was dying. John's voice on the tape is quiet, reflective. The headaches had been getting worse. He didn't tell any of us, didn't want to worry us while we were trying to make it. But in that letter, he wrote about seeing the Beatles from the outside, like he was already gone. He said fame would destroy us if we let it. He said we'd stop being friends and start being a business. He predicted it all. The mania, the pressure, the breakup. But he also said something else. The tape gets quiet here. You can hear traffic outside. Liverpool traffic from 1980. A world that would lose John Lennon in just 3 weeks. When he speaks again, his voice is thick with emotion. He said the music would survive. Long after the Beatles were gone, the music would keep bringing people together. He said that was our real purpose. Not to be famous, but to create something that would outlast us. And you know what? The bastard was right. The interview ends there. John changed the subject, talking about his new album, his life in New York, his son Sean. He never mentioned Stuart again in any recorded conversation. But those who knew him said he carried that letter everywhere until the day he died. It was found in his jacket pocket on December 8, 1980, stained with blood, but still readable. Yoko Ono has never revealed its complete contents, saying only that it belongs to history when the world is ready. The Shea Stadium concert of August 15, 1965, is remembered for many things: the record-breaking attendance, the birth of stadium rock, the beginning of the end of the Beatles as a touring band. But for 55,600 people who were there that night, it will always be remembered as the night John Lennon cried in public, the night the Beatles became human, the night a ghost from Hamburg reached across death to remind four boys from Liverpool why they picked up instruments in the first place. The real ending to this story is even more remarkable. In 2015, on the 50th anniversary of the Shea Stadium concert, Margaret Collins finally broke her silence. Now 66 years old, she revealed one last detail about that night. Stewart's letter to John contained a prediction about his own death. Not Stewart's, but John's. Stewart had written, "You'll know when it's time to open the box in Hamburg, when you start feeling like you're running out of time. Don't wait too long, John. The music needs to be complete." John had gone to Hamburg in November 1980, just 3 weeks before his death. Without telling anyone, he'd found what Stewart had hidden. Not paintings or recordings, but 23 songs Stewart had written lyrics for. Songs about friendship, loss, and redemption. Songs meant for the Beatles to record together. One last time, John had called Paul from Hamburg, suggesting a reunion. Paul had agreed. They'd planned to meet in January 1981. The songs remain unrecorded, locked in Yoko Ono's vault. Paul McCartney has confirmed their existence, but respects Yoko's decision to keep them private. George Harrison, before his death in 2001, said only those songs were Stewart's gift. Maybe someday, when the world needs them most, they'll be heard, but not yet, not yet. Ringo Starr, the last surviving Beatle who was on stage that night at Shea Stadium, was asked in 2020 about the concert. His response was simple: "That night changed everything. We went in as the Beatles and came out as John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Stewart gave us permission to be human." I think that's why the music still matters, because after that night, it wasn't just four lads playing rock and roll. It was four human beings trying to make sense of something bigger than ourselves. The original letter from Stuart Sutcliffe to John Lennon remains with Yoko Ono. Margaret Collins died in 2018, taking with her any other secrets Stewart might have shared. The wall in the Kaiserkeller, where Stewart hid his final gift to the Beatles, was demolished in 1969 when the club closed. But somewhere, in a vault in New York City, 23 songs wait to be sung, lyrics written by a dead artist for a band that would conquer the world and lose themselves in the process. Some say on quiet nights at the site where Shea Stadium once stood, now a parking lot in Queens, you can still hear the echo of that moment when 55,600 people fell silent, when John Lennon's voice cracked saying his best friend's name, when the Beatles stopped being myths and became men. The security guard Frank Morrison, now 89, still has dreams about that night. "I've seen a lot in my time," he says, "but I've never seen anything like that. It was like watching someone's soul break open in front of the whole world." And perhaps that's what Stuart Sutcliffe wanted all along. Not to be remembered as the fifth Beatle, but to be the one who reminded them they were human first, stars second. In that letter, read in front of 55,600 witnesses on a humid August night in New York, Stewart achieved what all artists dream of: immortality, not through fame, but through the lasting impact of a single perfect moment of truth. The Beatles played 1,400 concerts in their career. They conquered the world, changed music forever, and became the most famous band in history. But ask anyone who was at Shea Stadium on August 15, 1965, and they'll tell you that was the night the Beatles truly became legendary. Not for the music they played, but for the humanity they revealed. 3 words on a sign, 1 letter from the dead, and 4 young men who learned that sometimes the most powerful performance is the one where you stop pretending to be invincible and admit you're just as lost and broken as everyone else. That's the story of the night the Beatles stopped playing. The night Stuart Sutcliffe's ghost reminded them why they started. The night 55,600 people witnessed something that transcended music and touched the very core of what it means to be human, to lose someone you love, and to carry on despite the pain. Some moments in history are remembered for changing the world. This one is remembered for changing the Beatles back into John, Paul, George, and Ringo, four friends who loved music and lost their way in the machinery of fame, until a 16-year-old girl with a message from the dead reminded them who they really were. The music continues, the legend grows, but that night at Shea Stadium remains frozen in time. A perfect moment when the mask slipped, the truth emerged, and the Beatles proved that even gods can cry.